Well, I don't know if it was part of the Canadian school education, but somewhere along the line in my British education, we were told the story of Lady Godiva. Oh, you must know. Well, Lady Godiva lived, for those who don't, Lady Godiva lived in the Middle Ages, and she took pity on the people of Coventry because of the oppressive taxation that was imposed by her husband, Leofric, the Earl of Mercia. And she pestered him, and she pestered him, and she asked him again and again to go easy on the people. So much so that Leofric just couldn't take it anymore. And finally, he said to her, I'll tell you what, if you will parade through the streets of the city naked on horseback, then I will put down the taxes, lower the taxes for the people. Well, I guess Lady Godiva was one of the first socialists. And she determined that she would do just that, and the townspeople were asked for their support, and that entailed sort of staying inside so that they wouldn't embarrass her by gazing on her nakedness. But there was this young tailor named Thomas, and he just couldn't help himself, and he pulled the curtains, and he sort of peeked out, and he saw Lady Godiva as she rode by. And his actions initiated that inimical phrase, peeping Tom. I came across that story, and it was so good, I had to tell it. So if you're timing my sermon, it really begins now. Anyway, there was a little color commentary that has a little bit to do with the opening story that I'm going to tell you about the cathedral in Coventry in England's West Midlands. Because as it turns out, and this was the connection, the Earl Leofric and Lady Godiva were the earliest known financial supporters of the monastery and the church buildings in Coventry this goes way back to 1040. In the 1040s. And a little later, when Coventry became a diocese in its own right, around 1095, the main church building in this monastery and building, they were known as St. Mary's, that took on the role of a cathedral. And the building was expanded and expanded, especially in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. And the main sanctuary was renamed St. Michael's, and it was one of the largest cathedrals in Britain. Well, then comes Henry VIII, and during the reign of Henry VIII, monasteries were disbanded, and the see that was in Coventry was moved to nearby Lichfield, and the great cathedral over the next few hundred years began to decline. But when the see returned to Coventry at the beginning of the 20th century, the cathedral status was restored, and St. Michael's got some work and some renewal, and it again became one of the Church of England's great spectacles of a building. But nothing lasts forever. Just 20 years after it was restored, the building fell. 78 years ago this week, on the night of the 14th of November, 1944, the Luftwaffe dropped countless bombs on the city of Coventry, and in the melee, the cathedral was reduced to ruins. And you can see that there are a few pieces left standing, and that main wall there, the altar was within that section, and behind it, the provost of the day, Richard Howard, inscribed the words, in paint, I suppose, at that time, Father, forgive. Well, we're coming near, hold on to that story, we're coming near to the end of the liturgical church year. liturgical church year always begins with Advent, which is just around the corner. And as it happens, towards the end of the church year, we begin to encounter apocalyptic texts in the lectionary, the prescribed preaching guidelines. And that passage that Marcia read for us today, and when I read apocalyptic in general, I'm often reminded of the opening scenes of one of the Bond films, one of the recent ones, Skyfall, in which Bond is fighting with someone on the top of a train. One of his comrades in the British Secret Service mistakenly shoots him. He falls off the train into the deep waters of a river beneath a bridge, and the music starts. And then you hear the voice of Adele. This is the end. Hold your breath and count to 10. And that's the sort of thing that could have been sung in Coventry on the day after the Blitz. Bombs fall all around, and even the cathedral's destroyed. This is the end. And that's the sort of thing that seems to be implied by Jesus in this reading that we have from Mark chapter 13. Jesus and his disciples, they had been walking around Judea for quite a while. Jesus was building up a name for himself. The air was rife with stories about Jesus, and they finally enter into Jerusalem, the holy city. And Jerusalem's where it's all at. Like, this was where 1,000 years before that, David and Solomon had lived and built these great palaces and temples. And young men and women who were from Galilee, as were most of Jesus' disciples, had never seen anything like this. It's as if they had spent all their lives in Belleville, and then Scotty had beamed them over to the corner of Bay and King in Toronto. And you just get, oh. Here are the disciples. They're in Jerusalem. The buildings, the stonework, these massive stones, the size of it all. They've never seen anything like it. And they say to Jesus, look, teacher, look at all these great stones and large buildings. And Jesus says to them, you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. And the disciples, they're looking at this marvelous thing, thinking that it would last forever. Jesus, he foresees destruction. And big and great though these buildings might be, nothing lasts forever. This is the end. I keep thinking about music. I'm reminded when my children, they were a little younger, still at home. My daughter, sometimes I got to like some of their music, and my daughter really liked this group called Maroon 5, and I know you've never heard of them. The main guy, Adam Levine, he wrote a lot of the music, and in one of their albums, Levine sings about the end of a romantic relationship, and he says this, it's so easy to see dysfunction between you and me. We must free up these tired souls before the sadness kills us both. I tried and tried to let you know I love you, but I'm letting go. And then in the chorus, nothing lasts forever. Probably the greatest nothing lasts forever moment in my lifetime was the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the grand scheme of things, I was just surprised as I was looking up the history of it again. It was only there for 28 years. For those of you who are young, 28 years is a long time. For those of us that aren't so young, 28 years just seems to fly by. But for me, those 28 years were formative, and that was the year of years of my upbringing, and during that time, the wall, it not only divided West Berlin from the rest of the city, it came to symbolize the a divide, the Iron Curtain between the West and the East. And the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc of countries, they were a powerhouse. The United States and the West, they could rival them in terms of military might. And you've got this situation where if the U.S. and the Allies were perceived as a good, the Soviets and their allies were perceived as evil. Market economy in the West, a good. The socialist model in the East, a bad. Western Christian ethos, a good. Eastern atheism, bad, evil. And I kind of grew up with those dynamics. That was what I knew. That was part of my being and understanding of the world. I never contemplated that it would end. With many others, I was probably a bit like Jesus' disciples, just looking around the city and saying, wow, look at these great stones. Look at them. Just unfathomable that that wall could have come down. Just unfathomable that the East-West divide would have been overcome. But like the temple in Jerusalem, cathedral in Coventry, Adam Levine's relationships, nothing lasts forever. And in 1989, that Eastern Bloc and the wall fell. But here we have Jesus in Mark 13. And what he's pointing to is not just an end among other ends. He's pointing to a big end, like it's the end with a capital E, or all caps, end. And he speaks about wars and rumors of wars, and nation rising up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and earthquakes and famine, and persecution and betrayal, and this terrible pagan sacrifice in the Holy of Holies, suffering beyond suffering. And then, boom, the Son of Man descends from the clouds in power with glory and gathers his people from the ends of the earth. This is the end. All caps. Now, I know you're a United Church congregation and pretty sophisticated and modern. And like many parts of mainline Protestantism, we get squeamish a little bit when Jesus gets apocalyptic. We don't know what to make of it. When he starts talking about no stone on top of another stone, wars and sufferings and all caps, end. You know, there was a series of books came out from the evangelical realm some 25 years ago called Left Behind. You may have heard about it. But Left Behind isn't really part of the ethos in the United Church. Mainline, respectable, liberal Christianity, and we get nervous when Jesus gets all apocalyptic. What are we to do? We prefer it when Jesus is, a great moral teacher. He's having compassion for the poor or gives us a little spiritual boost, whatever it is. But there's none of that here. It's apocalyptic. And Jesus is on his way to his own end, and he talks about this great end. Maybe if we were somewhere else, we might view it in a different way. William Willman was on a mission trip as a student, and he told this story about, it was a trip to Honduras. And he said, a group of us worked a couple of weeks in an impoverished village, the village of San Marco. We ran a makeshift health clinic. And each night we would build a fire and sit with the villagers. One night, one of the students had a bright idea that we all go around and share our favorite Bible verse. Always a threat to United Methodists, he said, who aren't that big on the Bible. Well, someone mentioned John 3:16. Another person, the Lord is my shepherd. And then a Honduran woman who was speaking to us through an interpreter said that her favorite was Mark 13. Not one stone left upon another. Earthquakes, famine, fire. And she said this passage has always been such a comfort to her. Maybe it depends on where you live, what your experience is. There was a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, who had worked for 20 years in downtown Birmingham on a shoestring budget, this ministry to the homeless. And Williman, another one of his stories, he said she waved her hand one day and explained to him, I know a secret. All this is transient. With the living God, all this, including the evils, are transient. And they're dying in order to be reborn. And this gets to the heart of what Jesus talks about when he gets apocalyptic. Even this big E end, all caps, it's not quite the end. He uses a Greek word there, it's telos. And telos is certainly the end, but it also is used to describe completion, perfection, purpose. And what Jesus is pointing to is the perfection, the purpose of God's work, where it's all going. And he's pointing to a totally new kingdom and existence. And Jesus' message, above all, it's a message of hope. Now, I said to you, hold on to that story about Coventry, so we're going to come back to Coventry. The day after the bombing, on November the 15th, 1940, Richard Howard put the words, Father, forgive. They were painted on at that point, but they've since been engraved into that wall. And he and others determined that they were going to rebuild the cathedral in Coventry. It wasn't built the same as it had been. It wasn't built in the way that ancient cathedrals were built. It was no longer the big stone blocks and majestic pillars holding up a high ceiling. The new cathedral was going to be much more modern, they decided. They cleared away all the rubble, but they left in place the shell of the old. And they left that there as a place of visual aids to contemplation and testaments to the destructiveness that human beings can carry out. And flowing into those walls, they have the new cathedral. And the new cathedral, they enlisted the help of artists and architects, and they managed to build a cathedral that would catch the eye of the worshiper and lift a person up to God. Her Majesty the Queen laid the foundation stone in 1956. As I said, the ruins, they remain hallowed ground today, and together the old and the new, they create one living cathedral. In the 1990s, in Britain, a national poll saw Coventry Cathedral elected Britain's favorite 20th century building. But the rebuild, it wasn't just about bricks and mortar and visuals. Coventry Cathedral embarked on a powerful ministry, and it was a sign of faith and trust. And Richard Howard, that provost, he sought immediately to lead the people away from bitterness and hatred about the bombing that had occurred. And he started a ministry called the Ministry of Peace and Reconciliation. And that ministry in Coventry has branched out all over the place. And in many places where people are struggling with one another and there are conflicts, that work at Coventry has been able to go out and help people, other people, through their difficulties. That happened in Coventry. The end wasn't quite the end, but what Jesus speaks of is something far greater, a greater end, a greater change. And then I saw a new heaven and new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." No matter what we incur in life, that gives us hope. Let us pray. God of grace, in this place, in this life, things are not always bad and difficult. There are many moments where nothing much seems to happen, and there are many moments of happiness and joy. And yet there are those times in our lives, times of illness or grief, times when we look out around at bigger things happening in our communities and nation, and there can be times of persecution and great trauma. And those things leave us wondering about the state of the world. Or even times when things are so bad we wish for the end. But even then, you have pointed us toward hope. And we have hope because Jesus has pointed us toward life. And he rose from the death as the first fruits of a life that is to come for all who follow him. And so whatever is going on in our own lives, we thank you for hope. We thank you for the promise of renewal, newness. Maranatha, come, O Lord. Amen.